Hey friends, how we doing? Hope you're all doing well out there today. I'm back, not in the morning this time. We're still on Drive Time Radio on Facebook Live, but it's Drive Home Time Radio. And I want to talk once again about the arts rather, and a little bit about politics. My last one of these, I talked about the election, talked about how we got to stand up, we got to move, and for those of you who have been blind to Facebook and the arts over the last week or so, well, our Vice President-elect, Mr. Pence, went to see Hamilton, which is finally something I'm jealous of him about. By the way, if any of you can get me tickets to Hamilton, I'd really appreciate it. Super favor owed, perhaps, without me having to mortgage my house would be ideal. But here's the thing about Hamilton. I spent all day listening to it. I've been spending a lot of days at work listening to it. It's a beautiful score, beautiful show, really well done. I mean, just amazing. I haven't felt this strongly about a show in a long time, and really want to see it. But I want to talk a little bit about, the uproar. There's what happened, for anybody who doesn't know, is that Mr. Pence went to go see the show. On his way in, the crowd was, mixed reviews. There was some booing that happened, and then he watched the show. And at the end of the show, quite reasonably so, he got up to leave during the curtain call. He doesn't want to get bogged down by the crowd. Totally makes sense. I get that. But at the end of the curtain call, the lead actor asked him to stop and wait and listen to a statement, which was written for him by Lin-Manuel Miranda, who wrote the show. That was a very powerful statement about the fear and, I hate to say unrest, but the concerns that some folks in the country have about the Trump-Pence presidency, based on some of the statements that were made during the course of the election. Folks are very concerned that, civil rights are in play in a way that, they haven't been previously. That's, folks are afraid. They've seen some really, really strong rhetoric happening, and there have been some rumored appointments and confirmed possible appointments that reinforce those fears. And so they made a statement that was very powerful and very beautiful and very very positive, I think. I encourage you to go and listen to it or read it for yourself. And the discussion since then has been, was this an appropriate use of the theater? Was this an appropriate use of time? And I've had a couple of these discussions, and as someone who's been, involved in the theater for quite a long time, as an actor, director, techie, and lover of the theater, audience member, I have to say, I think this was a perfectly appropriate use of the stage. Not just because it's appropriate to the message of the play of Hamilton, which is a play largely about the uses of power and the cults of personality that come up in our governmental system of representative democracy and Republican democracy. And it has a strong message about the importance of immigrants to what America is. And these are all things that have played heavily into this election. Ms. Clinton was widely criticized, even amongst folks like me who voted for her in the end, for not being the person who we thought was representative of us, in terms of the way we wanted her to use her power. And the same concerns are there about Trump and President-elect Trump and Vice President-elect Pence. And so I guess it boils down to, what is the theater for? What is art for? And I've said this before, that art is there to make you feel. It's there to make you feel strongly in ways that ordinary life doesn't always give you freedom to feel. I think it's also, however, there to make you think about things that you don't always consider, that don't always bring you outside your bubble. And kudos to Mr. Pence for going to see Hamilton. I mean, that shows an open-mindedness. There's no way he doesn't know what the play is about. I'm sure he knows everything that the play is about before he walks in that door. And he went there anyway. He didn't have to. He went to see a point of view that is contrary to what everybody thinks his is, in large measure. And kudos to him for doing that. And kudos to him for staying and listening to the statement at the end. By all reports, he did, and that's great. Good. Listen to your constituency, which is all of us in this case. Kudos to the cast who called for the audience to stop with the booing and to allow the dialogue, because that's the most important thing. I do not agree with nearly anything in the Trump platform. I just don't. And less so with some of the things that Pence has been in favor of, if that's imaginable. But the important thing is that everything can be on the table. Everything can be discussed by reasonable people. We don't know how reasonable they're going to be in the day-to-day job. We don't. There's no way to know. This is a little bit like having a chaotic neutral member of the party in a D&D game, which, man, that's a nerdy reference. But you just don't know what's going to happen until it happens, and that's, I think, some of the source of the fear. We can only go on some statements that have been made, that some of which have already been walked back, and we don't know what's going to happen. But the theater and art in general, but I think the theater and film specifically and especially are about bringing these issues out onto the table for discussion. And so I applaud Pence for going to the show and exposing himself to a point of view that probably is not entirely his. And I applaud the cast for reiterating that point of view outside of the script, taking that opportunity on the stage to say, this is where we stand, and we don't know where you stand yet, but we hope that you stand with all Americans. And all Americans includes the immigrants that built this country, the Native Americans that have been horribly treated historically by this country, the African Americans who were brought here against their will in large part and treated horribly throughout most of our history, the Latin Americans, who are still marginalized, and the white Americans. Were not homogenous groups. None of us are homogenous groups. We all have individual concerns, and we all have individual needs, and as a society, we have societal needs for safety, for security, for privacy, for health, and for infrastructure and good roads and everything else. And our societal contract is such that we all chip in for the things that we all need. And we don't allow what we chip in to cater to the few above the many. But at the same time, we don't allow a tyranny of the majority. That is the point of the Senate, specifically, and a good measure of the point of the Electoral College, which I'm not a huge fan of, but part of the point of the Electoral College is to avoid the tyranny of the many over the few. Because just because there's a majority opinion does not make it the right opinion. And so we trust in our legislators and elected officials to discern the right opinion from the popular opinion. Now, many times, because I think that people are generally good people, those two align, and that's an ideal situation. But we have spent the last 20 years in a heavily adversarial government where the three branches of government are not working well together, I think. They are at odds with each other, whether that be because of politics or lobbyists or self-serving interests or tribalism, basic tribalism, states versus federal government, and so on and so forth. You know, the needs of California are not the same as the needs of West Virginia. But the people in California are not homogenous either. The people in California are individuals. California is a big place. And so they have the people in Northern California have different needs and wants than the people in Southern California, than the people in, you know, the Great Central Valley of California. That's one of the beautiful things about this country, I think. It's one of the things that make me patriotic about this country is that we're not a homogenous group. You can't say Americans the same way you can say, you know, a lot of other countries, especially in Europe, for instance, where they've been, you know, united groups with you know, borders that have been around for a lot longer, fluid sometimes. But, you know, if you're talking about Germans, it's a smaller area than America, and it's a group of people that have been the Germans for a lot longer than we've been Americans. And I love that about our country. I love that we have such diversity. And the statement that was made from the stage during the show and post-show, it was the same message. It was, we invite you to be part of the dialogue, to lead the dialogue, and also we implore you, Mr. Pence, Mr. Trump, the incoming Trump administration, the incoming Senate, the incoming House of Representatives, to represent the diversity of America. Let's not hold the needs of the few above the needs of the many, but let's also not give in to political expediency. Let's make some hard decisions. I think that that's really a critical piece of what our country needs in such an adversarial, polarized time. I'm not a Trump-Pence supporter, and I doubt that I'm going to be. I think I'm going to be a harsh critic throughout the presidency. But harsh critics are needed. They're needed now before they are inaugurated. They're needed in the first 100 days after the inauguration, and they're needed for the, 3 years, 265 days after that, until the next inauguration. Criticism is important, but let us also not be closed-minded and closed off. Because without dialogue, the ideas don't get out there. Criticize every idea, the ones you like and the ones you don't like, because no idea is perfect. One of the best ideas for government that has ever been devised is the Constitution of the United States, and it's been amended 27 times. 28 times? Many times. Sorry, I couldn't pull that number right up. But, it wasn't even ratified until it had already been amended 10 times. And it left out some pretty big stuff, like women having the right to vote, like the humanity of African Americans. Those things are left out of one of the greatest ideas in history for running a government. So yes, let's be critical. Critical in the sense of this piece of this idea is good, and it is trying to accomplish something good. And this piece of this idea is bad. You don't have to respect an idea. You have to be critical. You have to refine. You have to discuss, and you have to argue. And that's what rhetoric is for. That's what political process is for. It's that the ideas come through in their best possible form. Not their lowest common denominator, but in their best possible form for all parties concerned. It's the art of the compromise that has gotten us where we are. The art of the compromise is the art of making all of the parties equally unhappy with the result. What we need to move toward in an ideal situation is the art of the consensus, where all the parties are as happy with the result as possible. That's what I'd like to see our government do. And with each new administration, I hope for that. Because I guess I'm just a cockeyed optimist, to quote another musical, South Pacific. But I think that it can be done every time, no matter who's sitting in the White House, no matter who's at the Resolute desk in the Oval Office, making the decisions that are made there. There's a reason that George Washington gave up the office when he didn't have to. He really didn't. Everybody was shocked that he would, but he did. And there was a reason that everybody was shocked when Aaron Burr campaigned. Campaigning was frowned upon as low. He campaigned, and he lost, but he campaigned. And the office of the presidency is bigger than any one occupant of that office, as I'm sure any former president will tell you. We do not elect kings or potentates or all-powerful dictators, benevolent or otherwise. We rely upon the House of Representatives and the Senate to check the power of that office. And we rely upon that office to check the power of the Senate and the House of Representatives in the form of the veto, in the form of negotiation. And we rely upon the Supreme Court to check both houses, to look at the actual real-world effects of law and judge whether or not that law is having a positive or a negative effect on society and on the individuals to whom the law applies. That's why the argument about legislating from the bench is meaningless. It's not a real argument, because that is their specific job, is to say this law hurts people more than it helps people. That's not legislation, that's ethics. And the House of Ethics is the Supreme Court in the United States. The House of Law is the Congress. And the House of Everyman is the presidency. The president is our surrogate. He's the citizen's surrogate. I have to say he, because we haven't had a she yet, but I hope we will soon. Is the citizen's surrogate. So we need to make it very clear to President-elect Trump, to Vice President-elect Pence, that they are our surrogates, all of ours, whether or not we voted for them. Now they're our surrogates. And that's why we have to keep speaking up. That's why the protests are always legitimate, because you've got to make the noise. You've got to raise your argument up to the level of discourse. I do not condone the violence. I understand the frustration that leads to violence. Everybody's got that in them too. The fear that leads to violence. But arguing from fear is a weak argument. We have to argue from strength. We have to argue from logic. We have to argue from considered discourse and passion. There's a difference between arguing from fear and arguing from passion, and that difference is logic. It's setting aside the emotion that makes you want to make the argument and making the argument from fact, from reason. Because if you don't do that, your end result is never going to be consensus. At the very best, it's compromise. And compromise, well, as I said, compromise is everyone's unhappy. And there's an answer, but not the answer. The New Deal was not universally popular, but it's been pretty much universally successful as we look back with the benefit of history. The Affordable Care Act, far from universally popular, even amongst its supporters, because many, including me, think that it was a compromise bill. But we don't yet have the benefit of history to see what its effects are going to be. One of its effects is that people who couldn't get health care before can now. That seems positive, without going into prohibitive debt. Just the provision alone, which I was very happy to hear is not on the table at the moment for being cut against the pre-existing condition exclusions, is huge. Healthcare is meant to take care of people who are sick. If you're sick and you, because of that, can't get healthcare, you've missed the point. So that provision alone makes the bill worth it. It really does. And I mean, a sick person needs to be taken care of, and as a humane society, as a modern society, I don't know any ethical arguments against taking care of people who are sick. There are arguments to be made for the prison system being public or private. There are arguments on both sides. I know where I fall, and I know which arguments I will support and which arguments I think are more logically founded, and those are for public prisons. I think that it is not ethical or in the best interests of the nation to use private enterprise for such an important responsibility of government. We shouldn't foist that responsibility off, even if it is harder to do in government. But there are arguments to be made on the other side that cost efficiencies are more likely to take place. I just don't find those arguments to hold water. But I think the discussion should be there. And I think that discussion should be begun in passion and made dispassionately with logic and research and rigorous investigation. These are important issues that face this administration, this Congress, this Supreme Court, which hopefully will be filled again soon. An 8-member Supreme Court is less effective and less important than a 9-member Supreme Court. So I look forward to nomination process happening very quickly for that. And I understand the fear, what if we get a very conservative court? But looking at it dispassionately, I share that fear. Because of my bent on social issues especially, I would love to see a more liberal court, since we've had a conservative court for a long time. But we're replacing a very conservative justice. And we got some very, very good liberal decisions with that justice in place. So I have hope that whatever justice is named, that justice will have the ability to stand with the law, stand with logic, and leave the conservative or progressive pieces of that to passionate opinion and argument, but that decision is made from law and from logic. And all of this, I circle back to art. Because art is about passion. Art is about the beginning of the argument. Art is about putting it on the table. And I just cannot state it strongly enough that in every artistic venue, and I know many of you are artists and many of you are creating beautiful things all the time, I cannot state strongly enough that in every piece of art you make the statement, start the conversation, make people feel what you feel. Because that's going to begin the conversation. That's going to begin the persuasion. That's going to begin the process that leads to the end consensus. And no matter which side of the discussion you fall on, where your passion is where your art should come from, because then your audience will feel it. Then your audience will think about it. And that's what's powerful about art. That's why art is important. That's why the National Endowment for the Arts is important. That's why the That's why the government should be involved in encouraging art. It's a valuable piece of the discourse. It's where the conversations often start and should start. Not always. Sometimes the conversations start in tragedy. Sometimes they start with logic. Sometimes they start with individual's experience. And sometimes they start with a review of historical events. And those are all valid. But art is an important part of that discussion. And I think that the more often that art starts the discussion, the more often the arguments become more and more nuanced. Just for a point of clarification, I use the word argument in the classical rhetorical sense of a presenting of ideas and discourse of opposing views with supporting evidence and logical discourse, not argument from fallacy or ad hominem attack or straw man or any of the various fallacies that so often go into our social media discourse, and unfortunately often into our political public discourse too. That is a problem, because that is not an argument that leads to any resolution. Those arguments do not lead to resolution because they do not lead to the dispassionate discussion of evidence-based solutions. And those are the only solutions that are, in the end, truly powerful. So, I applaud Hamilton. I applaud Lin-Manuel Miranda for his amazingly beautiful script and music. And well-deserved Pulitzer. I applaud Vice President-elect Pence for exposing himself to the views presented in Hamilton. I encourage more of this, because this is where the discussion should start in my view, and I cannot see too much of it. I applaud all of you who are making art that is part of that discussion, that is seeking to start the discussion, that is seeking to contribute a piece of the argument, or make a member of the faction more passionate to make the argument. I encourage those of you who are making the logical arguments now to keep doing so, on both sides, all sides. Not everything is a binary issue. Almost nothing is a binary issue. And as humans, we like to reduce to my side or their side. That's our tribalism again. But it's not all about the two sides. So let's try to remember that. And let's make art. Let's feel things deeply and think about things hard. Let's do the hard things. Let's think about immigration. I mean, there are millions of undocumented immigrants in this country who want nothing more than to contribute to the well-being of this country. Let's think about how to get them there, and all of us take advantage of what our society has always grown upon. Every wave of immigrants that has ever come into this country has faced discrimination. From the Germans, to the Irish, to the Italians, to the Polish, to the Russians, to the Japanese and the Chinese and the Koreans and the Vietnamese and the Indians and Pakistanis, and every group that has ever emigrated to this country from every piece of the globe that exists. We have them all, and that's amazing, and that's part of the great power of this country, and they've all contributed a little piece of what makes us great. So let's have that discussion. Let's talk about how to find a way to make all of our undocumented immigrants a piece of the discussion. I mean, we can't write it off and still be Americans. We can't do it. We've got to get past that sectarian, make ourselves feel better by making the new guys feel worse mentality as a society. It's good for us. We need to do it. So let's have that discussion. Let's figure out how we do that. Let's figure out how we do that while raising all the boats. It's an important discussion to be had. And in my opinion, doesn't involve a fictional wall that just is patently impossible. I don't know of any way that it is possible. It's you can't deport millions of people either. Also impossible. Let's talk about the possibilities on all sides. Let's talk about reproductive rights. Let's talk about civil rights. We still need to have that discussion. That discussion's not over, and it's never going to be over. All humans are born equal. Well, all humans should be born equal. Let's make that as possible. Let's make that a reality. That is a goal statement, and I'd like to make it a reality in my lifetime so that it's true for my eventual possible grandchildren. Let's make all of these big social issues, let's get them out in the open. They're scary and they're hard and they make everybody nervous. But we're coming up on Thanksgiving, and that's when we have uncomfortable conversations with family. So let's have them. Let's have the uncomfortable conversation about the horrible plight of the First Nations peoples in our country. Because that has not gotten better. It's gotten worse. Or at the very least, it's stayed the same. Let's have that uncomfortable discussion, because we have a great national shame there that we need to really address. Let's address whether or not the rights of the stakeholders in private industry to make a profit, which is their right in a free and open society, are all important. Is that right as important as the rights to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, water that's clean, or food that's plentiful and easy to get and cheap? Because that's an important and uncomfortable discussion that can begin with art, and has been begun with art, and should continue to be begun with art. Let's have these uncomfortable discussions. Let's talk about the water in Flint, Michigan. Let's talk about what's going on in the Dakotas. Let's talk about the non-working and working and struggling poor in this country. Let's talk about homelessness. Let's talk that are not impossible to fix. They're not insurmountable in our great society. Let's open them all. Let's have conversations that make us feel bad. I think we should. And I think that it's dangerous to be insular and insulated from those. I think that one of the most important discussions that's going on right now in social media is the echo chamber. The fact that I can sit on Facebook and never see an opinion that differs from my own. That's dangerous. That's hard. Because you can't be critical about your own beliefs if there's no other person to be critical at them. And you can't listen to those criticisms if all you do is close your eyes and shake your head and say you are doing wrong. Is there an absolute morality? That's a philosophical discussion that I would love to have, and I have views about it. I don't have an answer. I don't think anyone will ever have an answer. But Can we legislate morality? Seems unlikely. Can we as a society agree about what is not permissible in our society? I think that's doable. I think as a society we can agree to certain things like you can't kill each other. Ever. And if you do, that's a problem for everyone. I think as a society we can agree that you can't make it harder for other people coming up behind you than you had it yourself. How about that? That's something I think is something we could all agree on. That if you worked hard, some of what you should be working hard for now is to make it easier for everyone else. I think that's something we should agree on, or at the very least talk about. And how do we make it easier? That's an important discussion. There's a lot of discussions that I think we should be having as a nation. And I think that the most important thing we can do is open our minds to those discussions. And I think that one of the most important ways for us to do that is through and with art. So, paint a painting, write a story, direct a play, write a song, sing a song, make a comic, make a thing, do a podcast, make a video, make art, make a statement, establish your point of view, establish the beginnings of an argument, show your passion, and then welcome the opposing point of view. And sit down with the person who opposes you and say, explain it to me. Explain it to me in a way that I haven't already heard it, that will help me understand where you're at, and then I will do the same for you, and perhaps we have a common ground. Perhaps our goals are the same, and we have two different ways of getting there. Who knows? You don't know until you have the discussion. And if all you say is this person is Hitler, or that person is an undesirable, or that person is corrupt, or that person should go to jail, then you've closed it. One of my favorite parts of theater, and one of the hardest parts of theater and comedy, is the improv. And part of what makes it hard is that its foundational rule is to be open to whatever. To yes and your partners. They're not your opponents, they're your partners. And to yes and them while trying to accomplish your own goal as a character in an improvisational piece is so hard. Because you want to shut down and stubbornly dig your heels in and say, this is what I want and I'm going to get it. And all that does is end the scene. And what you want to do, what you both want to do, is to continue the scene. And the only way to do that is to hear the other people in the scene and say yes and then continue the scene. So let's do that. Let's yes and politics. Let's take our discourse to a level that's hard. That's really hard to do. Let's be dispassionate. Let's say to another human being who disagrees with us on everything, I think that you're probably a good person. And I think that you probably mean well. And maybe you're speaking out of knowledge that I don't have. And maybe you're speaking out of experience that I don't have. And maybe you're speaking out of pain that I haven't experienced. And maybe I'm doing the same. And we can have some common ground. And we can work on a solution that alleviates the problems that we both see. and get to the end of the scene where I get what I want and you get what you want, and we have consensus instead of compromise. Because in 2016, after 15,000 years of societal human evolution, a history full of pain, death, and murder, and enslavement, and genocide, and hurt, and tribalism, and nationalism, and abject social Darwinism. We've also had 15,000 years of storytelling painted on the walls of caves in France and danced by Maori warriors in the South Pacific and by shaman in the Great Plains of the U.S. and by Mozart in Vienna and by every creative mind in history, by Leonardo da Vinci and Marie Curie, and we are creators and builders at our very basic instincts. It's our only advantage over every other form of life on this planet. It's why we're the dominant species and why we will always be the dominant species of this planet, why we bear responsibility for the future of this planet, and why we can make it better to be on this planet for all people, animals, everybody. And why we should expand beyond this planet. Why we have science, why we have philosophy, and why we have art is because we are creators and builders. We are the dreamers of dreams. So let's start from there. Let's say we're all dreaming dreams. We're all building something. Let's find out how we can build those somethings together and do better. Because it all comes back to creating something. Whether we're creating a jobs package or an economic plan or the great American novel or a summer blockbuster or a stupid rambling Facebook Live video on our drive home from work. We're building something and we're creating something, and I think that's something we can all agree on. So, let's take statistics to heart and take the outliers out of the equation and find that we're all basically the same. We want something, we feel passionately about things, we want to solve the problems that affect all of us. And let's do all that together. Because if we can do that, why in 2016 we can evolve out of social Darwinism and maybe find a way to leave compromise behind and find consensus. I guess that's all the rambling I've got for now. But this has been Ken's Drive Time radio on Facebook Live. And thanks to those of you who watched and listened and, let me know what you thought. Argue with me. Disagree with me. I love that. I want the argument. I want to hear you get passionate, and I want to see your art. Send it to me. Tell me what you think about what Hamilton did. That's important too. Let's talk about it all, because if we can't use these big brains for that, then what the hell are we all doing here anyway? All right, guys. have a great evening. Have a lovely night. Maybe I'll be back on tomorrow. And I love you guys. We don't have to agree on everything. We just have to be as human as we can be, I guess. All right. Bye-bye for now.